Good morning, everyone. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items, then I'll introduce Noelle. So, as always, please, if you have questions for Noelle throughout the presentation, type them into the chat, and she'll be able to answer as many as possible after the presentation concludes. And yes, we will send out the slides for this presentation within a couple of days, and I'll post the video online as well. So, now that the housekeeping items are over, let's get started. So our speaker today is Noelle Hicks. Noelle is a shareholder in our POA section of the firm. Noelle was just recently awarded the Excellence in Chapter Leadership Award from CAI. So big congratulations to Noelle for all she's done with CAI and to help the industry at large. So I will turn it over to Noelle.
Thank you for that, Kyle. That was the most gracious introduction I've had all day. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we are going to be talking about preparing for disaster. It is hurricane season, and so this is a great time for us to go over some of these items here today so that we can make sure that everyone's prepared for before, during, and after natural disasters. And I will get into that in just a second. We always have to give our disclaimer. So the information that I'm going to present to you today exists as of June 20th, 2023. Of course, this information is for educational purposes. It does not constitute legal advice. So if you do need some legal advice, make sure you reach out to your attorney. Now, before we get started today, I do want to give a little legislative update. Some of you may have already seen this, and actually TLAC just sent out an email, but Bill 1668 actually got vetoed on Sunday by Governor Abbott, along with about 50 other bills. And just to kind of recap a little bit about 1668, it was a bill that contains some clarification for the security measures. It also would have allowed for solicitation of candidates for the ACC. And if there were no candidates, it would have allowed board members to serve on the ACC. It also would have required websites for condominiums and also management certificates for condominiums. So essentially, it was kind of cleaning up some of the mess that was made in 2021. That bill got vetoed. Now, Governor Abbott actually vetoed more than 70 bills over the course of this past week, most of which originated in the Senate. This was actually Governor Abbott making good on a threat he made to veto a large number of bills if the House and Senate failed to compromise on property taxes. Now, the governor seems to believe that this action was a punishment to the Senate, but actually it was really a punishment to his constituents. In fact, we would actually encourage each of you to contact Governor Abbott's office and let him know that this punishment that he thought was directed at the Senate was really a punishment for constituents that spent thousands of hours with groups like TLAC to make sure that the language of these bills was just right, lobbying out in the heat in Austin. Some of us did that earlier this year, tracking these things over the last couple of months, all for it to kind of be wiped out by the political turmoil that's happening in the state right now. So also, as a result of VetoGate, as we've been calling it, the update that we would generally put out about the legislative actions will come out just a little bit later because we need to make sure that we incorporate all of the updates and all of the things that have just recently happened. So be on the lookout for that. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. We all live in Texas. We know that Texas is no stranger to natural disasters. And of course, like I mentioned, it's hurricane season until the end of November. So we are well into hurricane season. And we know that that can bring things like destructive winds and rains and the potential for flooding. And maybe even sometimes if you hear the word flooding, that triggers some PTSD in all of us, right? A quick story I'll tell you. So the other night, my parents and I were doing movie night. And yes, I still do movie night with my parents. But out of nowhere, we're sitting in the TV room and some really strong winds came in and popped out 3 windows in their TV room. So I spent the evening boarding up windows with my dad, thinking that a storm was coming. Much to my chagrin, nothing even happened after that. There was no rain or anything like that. But you know that that's how quickly things can happen here in Texas. And since we're right in the middle of hurricane season, anything is possible. So we all kind of just have to be on the lookout. I didn't realize this, but Texas is actually the most disaster-prone state in the country. There have been 372 federal disaster declarations since 1953. So that is actually making Texas have the highest number of billion-dollar disasters experienced And it also has Texas leading the US in total cumulative costs at about $380 billion. And yes, that's billion with a B since 1980. This is obviously Texas is number one, and then Florida is the second leading state with cost of about $370 billion. So this also, is largely the result of destructive hurricane impacts, tropical storms, and things of that nature. And we know that Texas and Florida generally get the majority, and we can throw in Louisiana there too. But this is just kind of put it into perspective. We experience the most natural disasters here, so we really have to be prepared and be on the lookout for these natural disasters that are probably going to be cropping up a little bit this summer. All right, so here in Texas, we experience these various natural disasters. I actually had no idea that fires were going to be so high on the list. But if you take a look at the little graphic that's there on the slide, you can see that all of the red spots on the map of Texas are where fires happen. And that's wild. I never even noticed that. But of course, flooding is the second highest threat that we experience here in Texas. Honestly, if you ask me, this week-long triple-digit forecast that we've been having needs to be added to the list of Texas natural disasters, because I cannot get my hair to look good no matter what I do. So heat and humidity is just not our friend right now. Anyway, so our goal for today, after I've just kind of given you a few statistics about what we experience here in Texas, we're going to plan for these potential disasters. We want to do anything that we can to minimize the impact to the association and its residents. I'll talk a little bit about finances and reserves. We'll get into some insurance issues, and then ways to communicate with residents and how important that is during this time period, during the season. Hopefully we'll be done within about 45 minutes, and that will give us quite a bit of time to ask questions at the end and for me to answer those. So if you guys have questions, make sure you add them to the chat, and I will get to them at the end. So let's talk a little bit about insurance first. Insurance is something that's like really high priority on a lot of associations' minds right now. Now, of course, during hurricane season and just year round in general, the association needs to make sure it has adequate general liability and property insurance that covers and protects all common areas and all buildings. So that's going to go for single family and condominium communities as well. Another important thing to think about with regards to insurance policies is that associations need to make sure that they have directors and officers liability and flood insurance, especially here in Houston and of course all over Texas. Flood insurance is a big deal. A couple of other things that you can consider is crime insurance and cyber liability. Those are not so much related to disasters, but those are also just things to think about. Now, make sure that the insurance coverage that you have has minimum policy limits. Those are often mandated by the association's governing documents. So you want to take a look at that to make sure that the coverage that you have meets those requirements that's in your governing documents. So really, in general, it's always a good idea for the association to kind of review whatever policies it does already have in place. That should be done on a routine basis to determine if the association is adequately covered in the event of a disaster, and whether or not there needs to be some additions or increases on the current policies that you do have. The association should definitely reach out to counsel or its insurance agent with any questions. Now, as it relates to insurance rates, one of the driving costs for the increase in D&O insurance has been a spike in claims that have been filed over the past couple of years, due in large part to lawsuits that have been filed against associations and their boards. Now, conversely, the increases in property and general liability have stemmed from the fear of claims from aging buildings in light of the Chaplain Towers collapse. So these are just all kind of things that you want to take into consideration. You might experience some increase in premiums. Things are getting more expensive, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And that's why it's really important to just kind of evaluate the insurance coverage that you do have in place to make sure that everything is exactly where it needs to be. Now, for your association, the sorts of conversations and decision-making factors regarding insurance are going to be different, right? Whether or not you represent a condominium association, single family, townhome, whatever it may be. So, that coupled with things like hurricanes and winter storms might add another wrinkle into those conversations. And when I say winter storms, yes, I'm talking about Uri. So now, particularly if you are a manager of a condominium, your association might be located in a high-risk flood zone. And so a master flood policy might be required as a condition of purchase or sale of units. That's another reason why it's really important to review those governing documents to determine what sort of insurance policies the association absolutely must maintain. Now, also for condominiums, understanding the difference in coverage between the residential condominium building association policy and a master hazard policy is really important. It's also important to note that associations or the owners that are a part of the association should consider insuring the contents of their own unit, which is always something that they should do over and above what may be required in the association's governing documents, in the RCBAP or the master hazard policy, because as Yuri showed us, right, the question of who is responsible for damage in a condominium may arise after a result of a disaster. So that's something that we actually need to really pay close attention to. So in addition of looking at your governing documents and just taking a close look at those policies, condominiums also want to look at the declaration. I mentioned that, but also sections 81.105 and 82.052 of the Texas Property Code for responsibility on different types of damage in a condominium unit. It's important for condo associations to work with their managers and legal counsel to develop a responsibility matrix that will help categorize the items whose responsibility is what, whether or not it's the association's responsibility or the owner's responsibility, and provide some clarity on that, because sometimes those things may not be as clear as we would like for them to be. And so it's important to get that that insight onto what may or may not be required. And so if you need some translating or some interpretation, a good thing to do is to consult with the association's attorney to try to figure out what exactly is necessary. And even sometimes creating an actual responsibility matrix, which is a graph that we kind of like to create that provides what the item is, you know, let's say, for example, interior of a unit, or if we're talking about the roof of a building or something like that, and who is responsible for it. So it makes it really clear for property owners, unit owners, or what have you, to just kind of look at that matrix and know this is what I'm responsible for, this is what the association is responsible for. All right, so following the Surfside collapse, many insurance carriers have been considering additional restrictions and exclusions to insurance policies. So this is making things a little bit more difficult for us, right? Industry-wide, for single family and condo associations, the number of insurers and available policy limits has been trending downward in the last few years. In fact, major carriers like State Farm and Allstate are no longer writing new home insurance policies in California. So, you know, the reason why they're doing this is they're saying that there have been too many natural disasters like wildfires, and that increased cost of new construction, those two things combined are making it difficult for them to fund these insurance policies. Now, the available policies are charged at a higher rate right now, right? Where, you know, there's inflation that's happening, of course, natural disasters and so on and so forth. So that higher rate combined with lower policy limits may not be truly adequate for what the association's needs really are. And in order to combat that trend, associations really need to be diligent in educating themselves and their owners on the trends in the insurance industry. Now, of course, higher insurance rates that affect all homeowners, that's going to happen. And sometimes we might need to consider whether or not we have to raise assessments or levy a special assessment to cover the cost of the rate of increase. Now, we also need to consider, as available policies continue to shrink, that the association is going to be at higher risk of paying larger amounts out of pocket, which could have lasting damaging effects on the association's financial situation. Of course, increased fees need to come from higher assessments, and potentially we have to reduce contributions to reserve accounts, which might exacerbate an association's financial situation. And I mentioned before, you know, we might have to consider levying special assessments to cover deficits, but that also can, you know, very much so lead to that strained financial situation that I was mentioning. Now, if Texas is the state with the highest number of natural disasters, could we be the next state where carriers are refusing to write policies? That would be a mess, right? It would also severely limit POAs in situations where policies are already hard to come by. So we don't know whether or not that's happening right now, but just if that is a trend of what's happening in California, then it's something that we need to be on the lookout for. and just understand how that relates to what the association's financial situation could potentially be. All right, so this is a kind of a list of things that you need to keep in mind when and if a claim needs to be filed. So the association needs to make sure it has all of the documents that it might need readily available. And then also, if there is, there may likely be a need for this. If there is some damage to one of the areas in the association, to the community as a whole, to common areas or recreational facilities or whatever, then a pictorial record should be kept. So what that means is that the association and perhaps the management company needs to make sure that there's picture evidence of what the common area, for example, looked like before the damaged area or the disaster came in and damaged the area, and then after. And I would recommend actually, you take a picture of the outside of it, but make sure you take a picture of the inside. Perhaps keep an inventory of, things that are in the common area. So for example, if we're talking about like a clubhouse, where their kitchen appliances, are there, other things that people can use to set up a party, tables, chairs, things of that nature. Pictures and inventory are something that could be very important in the event of a disaster, so that can become a part of a claim that you file with your insurance carrier. So just something to keep in mind, a recommendation for us. And this is kind of the same thing that that you're warned about when if you have like a car accident or something, right? That you hear the commercials that come on the radio and they tell you, make sure you take pictures of the accident, because you need to be able to present, the carrier is not there when the damage happens. So you need to be able to present pictures so that they understand what has happened, and what things looked like before that. All right, so what do you do after a natural disaster when it comes to insurance? So you want to, as quickly as possible, and as safely as possible, right? Locate all insurance policies, make sure you notify brokers and carriers. When possible, in the safest way possible, mitigate the damage. So if we're talking about a leak to a roof, maybe, you have to put a blue tarp. We've seen blue tarps all over the city of Houston after storms happen. Or maybe you need to do something like patch something up, patch up a fence or something like that. Mitigate when possible, but don't over repair or don't overdo anything, because you just want to make sure you stop the leak from happening, right? Make sure it's not going to damage anything else, because you don't want to interfere with what the insurance company might come in and evaluate, right? If there is some mitigation that happens, make sure you keep all the receipts for that. And then also limit the contracts to mitigation, because again, you don't want to go too far unless you are, sure that an insurance carrier or the policy will cover. You have adequate coverage, or you've had that conversation with the carrier and they can let you know, okay, this is something that's okay for you to go ahead and proceed and do or not. So, just kind of keep these things in mind, that after a disaster, you want to, act quickly, because the safety and security of residents is really at stake. All right, so we've talked about insurance. Let's get into the finances a little bit. And of course, finances are really important, because this is how the association pays for everything, right? So I'm going to talk about a capital reserve account, and I'll talk a little bit about the operating account. Now, if your association doesn't already have a capital reserve account, this is an important first step. You need to go out and research capital reserve accounts and open one up. Now, similar to maintaining a household budget, the community association also has to have that operating account for day-to-day expenses, and I'll talk about that in a second. But then this reserve account is set aside for more significant or long-term projects. So when I'm saying significant or long-term projects, some of the things that we're talking about are fence or roof replacement projects. That is a significant project. If you're talking about a condominium and the building's roof needs to be replaced, that's a big deal. Or if we're talking about in a single family community and one of the perimeter fences has been knocked down, that is a significant project. If, playground equipment has been damaged and needs to be replaced, or even if, replastering the community pool, these are some things that could happen without a natural disaster. But also, since we're talking about natural disasters, these are things that could happen as a result of a hurricane or something like that. So we need to make sure that we have something in place so that the association doesn't go into debt or bankrupt or anything, or even worse, is unable to actually take on these significant or long-term projects because it just simply doesn't have the money to do so. So now I mentioned with the reserve account, you can also take into consideration a money market account. That's, we could incorporate some savings into an account like that. That's really important too, because again, the association has to be able to save up some funds so that it can pay for things if there is a natural disaster. So, we're beyond COVID, so that's not really something that people are talking about as much anymore. But now we're dealing with rising costs due to inflation. And many associations can really expect an appreciable decrease in their operating account because of how the economy is moving right now. So if there is a withdrawal that needs to happen from the reserve account, you need to make sure that you actually have some money there to be able to take care of certain things when they come up. And again, a capital reserve account is important not just in light of natural disasters, but in any situation where there is some sort of significant or long-term project. You want to have some money set aside so that you can cover those expenses. Now, I mentioned the operating account. Of course, the operating account is for the day-to-day expenses of the association. So when of course, the board has the authority to make these expenses or to pay out these expenses. So for utilities, insurance premiums, taxes, accounting and attorney's fees, and other contract services, the association should have a checking account that is dedicated to these sorts of things. And again, keep that separate from your reserve account. So this is money that's going in, day to day, and that reserve account should just be sitting there, perhaps collecting interest or something like that, so that the money is saved up for when it's necessary. All right, so one of the things that's really important when it comes to finances is a reserve study. And this is something that is not just us, but it is highly recommended throughout the industry. Of course, a reserve study is based on an on-site inspection of the community and its facilities, and it really provides associations with a funding plan to assist the board with anticipating and preparing for major repair and replacement projects. So you can see kind of a continuing theme here, right? We want to make sure that the board is as prepared as possible, or has done the work to make sure that the association is prepared as possible for any sort of significant major repair or replacement projects, because inevitably, especially with aging communities, this is something that's going to come up. Now, a reserve study is going to assist the community association in creating that budget that ensures that not only the board, but also owners are secure in the fact that there will be money set aside for these major repairs or replacements. And of course, owners are contributing their fair share towards the reserve account, which would inevitably, that information would come from the reserve study, so that, and that's done with assessments, so that in the event that this happens, that reserve account is there and everyone's prepared. Now, it's interesting, now, of course, reserve studies have always been important, but now it's even more important because homeowners are giving more scrutiny to association activities, as well as mortgage lenders we're seeing. And of course, I just talked about insurance carriers. Everyone's paying more close attention to association maintenance and association business practices. You probably have heard us say this before, but Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are now requiring buyers to seek greater information on the deferred maintenance, reserve studies, and/or engineering studies of the association that they are moving into before they actually approve a loan. Now, some of the questionnaires that are coming from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are requiring this information for type of loans, but it could actually create additional liability for associations, because if anything on those applications is answered incorrectly, it might result in the loss of sale of a unit or send a signal about future special assessments due to deferred maintenance. So this is all something we should keep in mind and be really careful about. Owners and prospective purchasers are also asking more questions on these topics like maintenance, reserve studies, and so forth, because we're in the wake of the Surfside collapse. And so, that is just raising a lot more questions for associations to answer. So it's really not a leap to think that other vendors, such as, we're talking about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac right now, but if you consider those insurance carriers, they might start instituting similar practices, requiring applications that ask questions about the association's maintenance and business practices so that it can, take that into consideration when determining whether or not they are going to actually issue a policy. Now, I talked about inflation just a little bit, but deferred maintenance also becomes an issue and stems from the lack of financial health with many associations. A lot of times associations don't really want to increase their assessments, or, because of course they want to make sure that homeowners can actually pay, the assessment amount. And, that's okay. But sometimes when you have conducted that engineering or reserve study, then you might see the need to increase assessments, because you need to make sure that all of the things that come out in the reserve study are adequately or appropriately funded. So any future needs for the association they're going to need money. So you got to make sure that you are putting a funding plan in place for any major repair or replacement projects. Now, this is important too, because those institutions that I mentioned, like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they're also requiring buyers to seek greater information, that application that I'm talking about, before they're giving that loan. So you want to make sure that you have the adequate information with that, because it really lessens your risk. It lessens the risk of losing out on that sale, right? Sale of the unit, sale of a home in a community or something like that. But really, it's really going to give more confidence to the buyer. It gives more confidence to the institution, and it gives more confidence to the board when they have completed that reserve study too, of whatever obligations that they might have in the future. Because everyone's relying on those reserve studies. They're really important. They are done by professionals. You have engineers come in to take a look at the structure and the health of the community, really. And so everyone's really relying on those reserve studies. And so it's important to make sure that we get those done, get those in place, make sure that things are properly funded so that we don't have any issues later on in the future. All right, so if the association does a reserve study and it finds that it needs some help paying for something, right? Of course, all the associations are not going to be as well funded as others. And so there might be some instances where it needs help paying for damages after a natural disaster, or just, some other major repair or replacement. There are various resources to go to find it. So of course we have community association banks, the banks that help and deal solely with the community association, so they're familiar with how things work. There's also community banks. You could look into SBA disaster loans and even go to FEMA. But one of the major things that you want to do is go and look into the dedicatory instruments and see what the requirements are. Make sure that the association has the authority to take out a loan. Make sure that the association has the authority to enter contracts. Those are things that you want to look at before you go out and seek these resources, to make sure that it's possible for, the association to become bound to a loan or something like that. All right, so let's talk about records. Now, I'm going to tell you a story. We have a management company that we deal with, and this happened quite some time ago. And I think it was after Harvey, if I'm not mistaken. Harvey was one of the storms that we encountered that gave us a lot of flooding, damaged numerous amounts of homes. But at the time, this management company was dealing mostly in paper. They had not yet, maybe followed the trend of people going paperless or having digital records or anything like that. So when Harvey came and flooded everything, mostly all of the records that this management company had were completely damaged. Now, that was a problem for several reasons, but on my end, let me explain why it was a problem. When I am turned over a matter, whether it be a collection or deed restriction enforcement matter, I need evidence to be able to provide not only to the owner, but in the event it reaches the stage of litigation, to a court, that there was a violation of the restrictions, right? So that means I need copies of 209 letters. I need account histories for collection matters. And then for deed restriction enforcement, I also need those 209 letters. I need pictures of the violation. Account histories come into play here too, in the event that there's fines or other fees that have accrued on the homeowner account. But it's really important to have that information. One, the Texas Property Code requires it, right? We have to have proof that we've given notice to a homeowner before that there was some sort of enforcement action, or before we actually initiated collection procedures. But also we just have to, that's part of the evidence that we would provide in litigation. There were several cases that we already had that all of that information either got destroyed or, was messed up somehow, or things that were turned over to us after the fact, after Harvey, that did not have that information. It makes it very difficult to actually pursue a collection or deed restriction enforcement matter if you cannot prove to the homeowner when the violation started or when they first missed their first payment of assessments or what have you. So with that, the recommendation is to make sure that all of your records are backed up. And when I say backed up, I mean make sure that you have some sort of digital way of backing up your records. Of course, now associations are required to have a website that contains the association's governing documents or dedicatory instruments, as we call them sometimes. But I'm not only talking about documents, you have to make sure that your contracts, your records, like your meeting minutes, financial records, and things like that are all backed up, account numbers, so that you are able to, keep straight the different account numbers that are associated to homeowners. And any other important things that the association maintains, all its records that are being maintained according to its document retention policy, that sort of thing. Any sort of databases that you have, all of the homeowner contact information. One of the rules is that homeowners are generally supposed to make sure that the association has their most up-to-date and recent contact information. And in some instances, a homeowner has to provide an email address or opt into receiving email information from the association. And so if that kind of stuff gets lost, then that can become a nightmare for management companies. So the recommendation is to make sure things are backed up. And in this age of 2023, you could do all sorts of things to make sure that that's backed up. Put it in the cloud somewhere. I don't know. I'm not an IT person, but it's really important to make sure that this happens, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're having to constantly tell someone, we lost our files, we don't have what you're asking for. So make sure that if that's not being done right now, go back to your, respective locations where you are and hit back up, just the same way that you back up your phone. How annoying is it when you get a new phone and you haven't been able to back up your contacts on your old phone, and then you have to switch to your new one, or like your phone got stolen or something like that, and you don't have all your contacts and all of your, text messages are gone, or all your pictures are lost. It's kind of the same idea. So make sure that you get all that information backed up so that you are not searching for it somewhere down the line, or don't have it somewhere down the line. All right, so maintenance is really important. And this is something that we need to talk about for before and after a natural disaster, right? So when I mean maintenance, I'm talking about, things like piping and drainage, whether or not your drainage has been cleared of debris, because if it has been, then it'll help reduce flooding and water backup. Also, tree maintenance, it would be a good idea to go around the community and see if there's any trees that need to be trimmed, removing dead, old, and unsturdy trees so that these trees don't fall over onto someone's home or car, especially if those trees are in the common areas. You just want to make sure that everything is as neat and trim as possible so that no extra areas for damage are available, right? And then do things like cleaning up brush, weeds, or, sticks, I don't know, but doing things to eliminate or reduce fuel for wildfires. Because again, as we mentioned, Texas has the highest number of disasters are related to fires in Texas, which was new information for me. I just recently had to go into a community, or go into a community's governing documents to take a look at the requirements for drainage, right? So drainage has become a really big issue in a lot of communities, depending on where they are. And sometimes drainage or who's responsible for it is not always as clear as it could be. So you really want to figure out ahead of time who's responsible for maintenance. A lot of times we are having people come to us when drainage has already become an issue to find out who's responsible for making sure that there's adequate drainage. Of course, we know when we're talking about lots, homeowners are generally responsible for not altering the drainage or not, making it so it's redirecting the flow of water. But when we're talking about common areas on the streets, things of that nature, we have to kind of look into the governing documents to figure out who may or may not be responsible. And something that I just recently learned is not just looking at the governing documents, but looking at the plat maps, because plat maps sometimes will tell you who's responsible for drainage, whether or not there's a drainage easement, that kind of thing. So since it's not always clear, you want to make sure that that's something that you kind of look into ahead of time. So now would be the time to kind of figure that out. And then if it's not clear, then possibly consider a board resolution about the responsibility of, making sure that the drainage is adequate, or maintaining, if you have ditches or something like that in your community, who's responsible for maintaining that. And then include in that resolution, who's going to be responsible for the cost, maybe assessing the cost of it as you're going through and kind of figuring it out. And the potential for damage, and then who's going to be responsible for all of that as well. It's better to have that sort of thing in place before a disaster than after. So then after, you want to make sure, and I talked about this a little bit before, when the damage, maybe there's some damage that has been done to the community, go through the community, take pictures of everything, do your best to mitigate any issues. So if there's flooding, clear the drains, that kind of thing, so that it doesn't become a situation where a clogged drain resulted in the flooding of some of the community members' homes, right? So maintenance is a really big deal. And of course, this all kind of really ties into what we've been talking about, which are, reserve studies, insurance, just making sure that you're prepared for what might be coming ahead, because, with climate change, everything is, water's hotter, it's hotter here in Texas. We're going to experience some things, right? So we just need to be doing these things to make sure that we're prepared. All right, another thing that's really important is communication. Now, we all know that we want to get information about an upcoming storm, the way that we normally hear about it is from the news. And if you're like me and you like to watch ABC 13, I love it when Travis Herzog tells me what's the forecast for the day. I don't know why I love him so much, but I feel like he really knows what he's talking about, even when he gives me the wrong forecast. Regardless, it's really important that if we know that a storm is coming, we have to make sure that we listen to, pay attention to what the news is telling us, pay attention to what the forecast is and everything, but also communicate that information to the community. So it might be a good idea to designate a spokesperson, perhaps the managing agent, maybe the board president, maybe the secretary, I don't know. But whoever that spokesperson is going to be, they need to provide regular and reliable information to everyone, all the residents, all the staff, contractors, if that's a possibility, and any visitors. So if you have designated a specific person, then that person is going to be in charge of distributing communication across whatever channels you have available. So I mentioned before that associations are required to have websites now. That would be a really good place to start putting updated information about any, coming storms. Another really good place is if the association has an association-run social media page. That would also be a really good place to put information about, the forecast, when the storm's coming, when it's projected to hit, and what the association is doing to ensure the safety of the community. Sometimes you might send out email blasts. That might be a good way. If you have a system that texts all the neighbors, that might also be a good way. Now, of course, we're not going to send out those things on the phone that make that obnoxious noise that wake everybody up in the middle of the night. But you know what I mean, right? You want to make sure that you're communicating every way possible with whatever channels that you have available, so that everyone has all of the information that they need to have. And, we hope that people are taking it upon themselves to do what they need to do to stay up to date on what's going on. But even if you are providing reminders, hey, everyone, it's hurricane season. Make sure you stock up on water and supplies. Make sure you have batteries, get a radio, that kind of thing, so that people are just taking, action to make sure that they're going to be safe and protected. And if there is some sort of message for an evacuation, that's something else that you might want to put out there. So communication is really important. Now, again, you're not requiring or demanding anyone to do anything. These communications should just be providing information, perhaps recommendations, but you're not going to force anyone to do anything, right? All right, so communication is really, really super important. All right, and so this is also really a big deal. A lot of times after storms, for some reason, people think this is a good time to scam everyone. And it's always so unfortunate when this kind of thing happens, but here's just a couple of things to look out for. If it's a new guy in town, a new contractor that you've never worked with or anything like that, you want to make sure that you do your due diligence, right? do your homework, check out the background, look online, see if there's reviews, just kind of make sure that you do as much research as you can about the new guy in town. Take bids, because that's always important. Of course, we have the bid solicitation requirement in certain situations, but look at those RFPs. And then when you are trying to locate a contractor, again, do your homework. So look at how long that contractor has been in business, perhaps do a reference check. Have you used this contractor before? Are they willing to work with an association contract, and do they have the necessary insurance? Now, that last bullet point, do they have the necessary insurance? That's actually very, very important. So one of the things that I like to make sure, if I am given the opportunity to review a contract, is make sure that I see the vendor or the contractor's certificate of insurance, because it is really important for the association to be aware of that contractor's insurance coverage and whether or not it's adequate for whatever job that they're being hired to do. So it's a recommendation, and it's actually a pretty strong recommendation, that all your contracts should be reviewed by the association's attorney, because we know what to look for. And of course, managers also know what to look for. But as far as legally is concerned, we want to make sure that all of the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted with these contracts, because you don't want to run into a situation where you're ending up having to sue the contractor for some reason, and then you can't figure out if they have adequate insurance, there's no contract in place, these kind of things. So keep these things in mind when dealing with contractors as well. All right, so let's just say a natural disaster comes about, God forbid. We don't want that to happen, but if it does, you want to make sure you do the following things. Make sure you're reasonable. Make sure that you are not, I'll talk about this in just on the next slide, but just be reasonable. That's really important. People are dealing with a lot after a natural disaster, after a hurricane. They're dealing with their own, personal issues, maybe trying to make repairs in their home. Maybe they're trying to find somewhere to stay because their home has been completely damaged, something to eat, whatever. So just be reasonable. That's important. And then consider the ACC issues, right? So send out those important reminders to the community. If you have designated that person to be the spokesperson for the community, have them send out reminders about how the association will handle things, what the practices are going to be for after the storm. Maybe consider implementing an expedited review of ACC applications. And then keep in mind, after the last disaster that we had, and actually this has been happening a lot more lately, there's always been material shortages. After COVID, that was an issue, supply chain issues, but also, people are going and they're going to go buy up all the pipes, or they're going to buy up all the plywood and that kind of thing. So just consider that there might be a shortage of some materials. So keep that in mind when you're giving people timelines in order to have certain things completed on their property. All right, and then finally, I think this is the last slide. Another thing to consider when it comes to after the incident or after the natural disaster, how is the community going to move forward with enforcing the deed restrictions? This was one of the things that we really had to consider during COVID, was the collection of assessments. Now, we knew that there was a financial strain on lots of people. People were losing their jobs. They were, having a hard time paying for childcare and that kind of thing. So if we kind of, bring this into the present with the natural disaster conversation, did the community suffer significant issues? And if it did, maybe it would be a good idea to delay the collection of assessments, or give people a little bit more time to actually pay their assessments, because they might be having to pay for materials or pay a contractor to put the roof back on their house or something like that. So a discussion about that should be had. And if the community did not have significant issues, still, you just kind of want to read the room, right? Take a inventory of what's going on in your community. And determine if it's appropriate to put a delay on the collection of assessments, or if you should just do things as usual, right? And then when it comes to the enforcement of restrictions and fining, take a look at the difference between pending actions and new actions, right? After Uri, there was a lot of landscaping issues that came up. The storm came through and it froze everyone's, plants and ruined a bunch of stuff. Whether you can make a decision about whether or not you're going to enforce landscaping violations, or if you're going to give people some time to kind of recuperate. So these are just some things that we want to remind you of, take into consideration. Of course, a compassionate and understanding approach is recommended, because again, people are dealing with a lot. You know, the world is getting more and more fierce. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where there's some sort of confrontation or anything like that. But if you just have a little bit of compassion, you know, everyone just dealt with the natural disaster in these situations, and give a little grace, right? So that is what I have for you guys today. I want to thank you all for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and all of the webinars that we do here at RMWBH. It really is a lot, right? It takes a lot of hard work to put these together from Kyle's team and from the attorneys that actually do the webinars. And we always hear when we're talking to you guys that you really enjoy them. So on behalf of the firm, I want to thank you all so much. And I do have one request. So if everyone could take a minute to give us a 5-star review on Google, that would be so awesome. Kyle is going to put a link in the chat so that you guys could just go straight to it. It'll make it really easy for you. It'll go right to the page. Give us a little review. And you guys, that's it. I have a couple of questions I'm going to go into right now. But thank you again for your time. And if you need to drop off, that's totally, we totally understand. And thank you guys that sent congratulations to me in the chat. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So our first question is, how often should you have a reserve study done? So this is really going to depend on your community. Now, we recommend having one done every maybe 2 to 3 years. But that's also a conversation for you to have with the professional that does the reserve study, because they can give you a better idea of, let's say, for example, you have a fence, and that fence will hold up for another 2 years, but then, you know, after that, you need to take into consideration replacing it. So maybe the reserve study is done, you know, in 1 year, and then 2 years later, you do it again to kind of reevaluate where that fence is, or how that fence is looking. But it's really going to depend on the community, the age of the community, whatever updates you might have done already. If there has already been some maintenance and repair, that's a good thing. But just, you know, 2 to 3 years will probably be a good gauge. How much the reserve study typically costs? That's also going to vary greatly depending on the type of community that you're having the reserve study done for. And so I'm not really sure how much it's going to cost, but there'll be a lot of factors that are considered, because, you know, consider if it's a huge community, there's a lot more things for the engineer to look at, right? And even if it's not, maybe there's some major drainage that goes through the community. So that might be something that might be a little more expensive. I'm not really sure. But again, the reserve study professionals will be better at answering that for me than me. All right, so the next question is, what is required to put in a delay on assessments? Would it be a resolution from the board? Is there a stipulation on recouping assessments? So what we have done in the past is basically, you could do a resolution, because that's something that could be recorded in the real property records and make that, you know, effective. But also, you could send out a e-blast and say, you know, we understand that the assessments are generally due on January 1st, let's say, for example, and they become delinquent on the 31st. But in light of the natural disaster, we are going to delay assessments until March 1st or something like that. And you want to make sure that you refer the homeowners to your collection policy if you have one in place, and perhaps the payment plan policy if you have one in place. But you want to err on the side of giving them the most information, or more information than not, because then it will be harder for them to say, oh, I didn't know, or, you know, I wasn't aware, or whatever. So you could either, you know, just make a community-wide broadcast. It's something that could be announced at board meetings and perhaps at a town hall or something like that. And a board resolution would do it too. Brad, yes, Kyle will send out the confirmation of the session for the CE credit. And let's see. Oh, Kyle already answered that. Can RMWH provide a matrix of items the HOA is responsible for? Okay, and that's going to be something that's specific to the community, right? So what would be required in that situation is actually combing through the documents and figuring out what the association is responsible for, like figuring out what the amenities are, what, you know, maybe if we're talking about a condominium, the difference between general and limited common elements and things that are inside of a unit. And then looking at the documents and finding out, is the association responsible for this, or is the homeowner or the unit owner responsible for this? And that's how the matrix is created. So it's something that has to be on a case-by-case kind of investigation, just to figure out what it is specifically to that community. If there are no other questions, I told you guys I'd try to wrap this up in about 45 minutes, and I think I almost did that. I really appreciate you guys so much. Again, don't forget to give us that review on Google. I think that Kyle is going to send out that link. And if it doesn't get in the chat, then he'll send you guys an email to provide that link for you. So it's Tuesday. Have a good rest of your day. Try to stay cool out here in this heat, and I'll see you guys out there. Bye.